Today's case is going to be about a car who backed into a house and crashed into it in a very bizarre way. Today on Crime Dope, we're talking about the disappearance of Brianna Maitland. Brianna disappeared in 2004 as a 17-year-old teenager in Vermont. Brianna had an older brother, and she lived with her older brother and their parents at a farm in East Franklin, Vermont, near the Canadian border. Brianna grew up in a very kind of remote area near the Canadian border. The closest major city to where she lived was actually Montreal, Quebec, Canada. It was only about around a 90-minute drive from the place where she was last seen, and she had kind of expressed interest, and I'm sure in a way a lot of people grow up in remote areas do, of living in a big city, and she wanted to either live in New York City or Montreal. So it seemed like Brianna had a fairly normal, happy childhood. It did appear, though, when she got into being a teenager, things got to be that she had some problems. She was actually, at the time of her disappearance, she had dropped out of high school. She was also not living with her parents at the time of her disappearance. She was actually living with friends and bounced around a little bit and moved to a couple of different friends' houses or friends' couches. Still as a teenager, at the time of her disappearance, she was actually a high school dropout. Though, the day she was last seen, though, she was in the process of completing her GED, which is it's basically a test you take instead of going to high school that basically says, hey, you meet the requirements of what you need to know for high school, and you've officially graduated high school, even though you didn't go to the classes. It's just essentially a certification test, essentially, for high school. Brianna appeared to not like school. It's also been reported or had friends who dealt with drugs. It being a remote part of Vermont, it's tough to really visualize what that means. A couple weeks before her disappearance, Brianna got into a physical fight with her friend Kaylee. And Brianna's father thought the fight was over a boy. Strange to see two teenage girls actually get into a fist fight. Brianna was trained heavily in jiu-jitsu, which is unusual for someone in Vermont, a teenage girl in Vermont. It's interesting. And she did not use her jiu-jitsu skills to defend herself against Kaylee. Maybe she didn't want to hurt Kaylee. Brianna actually suffered a broken nose during the fight and a concussion, so there was some injuries in this altercation. Let's move to the disappearance. The day of the disappearance is March 19th of 2004 in Montgomery, Vermont. Montgomery, Vermont seems to be a relatively small town. It seems like there'd be under 3,000 or 4,000 people there. A couple thousand people may live there, maybe not even that. It's just essentially a couple main streets. So Brianna, she dropped out of high school, but she did take her GED test that day. And she met with her mother, Kelly, and they went out to lunch. Kelly believed that Brianna was going to pass the GED, and so she'd be passing high school. And Kelly said Brianna wanted to go to college, so she was probably encouraged by that. So the mother and daughter, they go out to lunch and they went shopping. There was a report that Brianna saw something outside the window. I think just imagine this is at like a grocery store, and she told her mom that she was going to head outside, and her mom just said, okay, I'll meet you in the parking lot, something like that. So when Brianna's mom, Kelly, sees Brianna in the parking lot, she seemed nervous and scared. It's been described unnerved, but she never found out what exactly happened in the parking lot. Brianna never mentioned it to her. Kelly and Brianna drive to Brianna's friend Julian, who she's living with, in the afternoon, and she drops Brianna off. Brianna gets dropped off at Julian's house, and Brianna leaves a note to Julian that she'll be home later that evening. Brianna goes off to her shift at the Blank Lantern Inn, where I guess she was a waitress. It was a restaurant. It looks like a pretty nice place. It looks like an expensive place. And around 11:20, Brianna leaves her shift and goes home. She completes her shift. Some of Brianna's co-workers wanted to know if she wanted to get dinner with them. She declined, and she said she had to get ready to go to her second job tomorrow. So we're going into Saturday. Tomorrow would be Saturday. And she just left, and her coworkers appeared. She said she was fine. Basically, then what happens is that's the last time anyone saw Brianna. Going into the next morning, we see a very bizarre photo of Brianna's car crashed into the back of a farmhouse. I think it was abandoned at the time, but it's a farmhouse, and the car is essentially backed into it. And the best way to describe it is just show the image, and so you can see in the image right there, the way the car is positioned, it doesn't appear that it accidentally, that's how there was an accident, that's how the car was crashed into. There didn't appear to be any kind of tire tracks or anything indicating a big screech or crash, stepping on the brake. It just appeared that someone backed the car into the house. I mean, the car is literally through the house. It broke into the house. So it appears it was intentionally crashed into the house that way. For what reason, we don't know. There were a couple of sightings that night, but going into the morning, in the middle of the night, of Brianna's car, and they had a couple of people say they passed by and they just didn't see anything, and they thought it was strange or it was a drunk driver, but they didn't see anyone on foot near the car. Unlike Murray's case, there were witnesses of people that they actually saw someone walking along the side of the road. But there's nothing like that, to my knowledge, of the Brianna Maitland's case, of someone seeing someone strange walking alongside the road. We have that. Going into the next day, Julian actually was out of town the day she disappeared, that weekend. And Brianna left a note saying that to Julian that, hey, I'm going to be gone for a couple of days. When Brianna wrote the note to Julian saying that what time she'd get back, Brianna, I guess, didn't appear to know that Julian was actually leaving town, so Julian never saw the note. In this case, one of the big issues we get into is no one knew Brianna was missing until it was too late, essentially. So we know that next day, a Vermont police officer sees the car. He figured it was a drunk driver, and he had the car towed. And in the car, there's an ATM card left, and her paycheck is left as well. Definitely doesn't appear like someone was going to run off. This is a 17-year-old girl. She probably does not have access to thousands of dollars of financial reserves to walk away. So I would say in this case, walking away is probably the lowest probable outcome in this case. She's leaving behind money, paychecks, and there's other random stuff in the car. It does appear, though, from the research I did, that the keys were taken. So it does appear that the police were not able to recover the keys of the car, which I find interesting and important. And basically after that, the case largely goes cold. This is a remote area. I would say we're not in the forest. It's not something that where the car crashed. It's not like there'd be one or two people driving by. It's this country road in Vermont, but it's a pretty remote area. There were houses around, largely farms around where she disappeared, so there were people around, but it was probably not a large amount of them. And it's not till a couple of days later, till the middle of next week, that Brianna's parents finally have learned that their daughter is missing, because Brianna's mom saw her on Friday and wanted to respect her independence. She didn't see Brianna every day, because she didn't live with them. So she thought everything was fine. So it wasn't until in the middle of the next week that her parents even know she was gone. Julian didn't come back till a couple days later after she left, so she had no idea she was missing. So there was no connection to the police. Obviously, a mistake in this case was the police just towed the car. There should have been a crime scene investigation done around the car, but that didn't happen. And throughout the years, as we get into 2023, Brianna's case there's been reported random sightings of Brianna, but nothing that has been deemed super credible. one of the things that's really interesting in this case that hasn't been released until the last couple of years is that they actually were able to get a DNA sample from the car, which is very interesting, which gives this case a lot more hope than what you would typically see in other cases. And the Vermont police basically said, out of the 11 people we tested for DNA, there was a match within one of them. So it's clearly someone Brianna most likely knows, most likely. That's definitely not enough to get a murder conviction or a foul play conviction or a criminal conviction. I would say, though, one DNA sample. As a defense, they could just say, hey, I gave this person a ride to my work, or I gave them a ride. So you're going to need more evidence to convict someone with just a DNA sample. But unlike cases like Brian Schaefer, Jennifer Kesse, those cases, Murray, there's no DNA evidence. There's at least a DNA connection in this case. And this has only been revealed in the last couple of years, but the police are not identifying who it is. And I would imagine they're possibly trying to build a case around this person or see if they could have any kind of involvement in this case. Brianna obviously could have just walked away and been found in the woods, and she could have got lost, or she could have got a concussion, and she could have just died in the woods from starvation. In my theory, I think there was someone who was able to kind of to get Brianna to stop alongside the road, and somehow a crime took place. She was murdered, and the person was able to back her car into the house, and they escaped somehow, or Brianna was kidnapped. I don't think Brianna is alive. That's, I think, what happened in this case. But I do think this case has a greater likelihood of being solved than some of the other disappearances we've covered on this channel. Yeah, I think in the next maybe year or two, there will be new developments in this case. And, yeah, it's definitely, I feel this case has kind of been upstaged by the Murray case, which she disappeared relatively close to where this case happened, and only like 6 weeks later. And for whatever reason, Murray is like the rock star of disappearances. But this case is also pretty well known. It's just not as well known as the most publicized missing person case ever, or one of them. That's kind of everything that, all the main things that happen in this video. Subscribe to Crimer for more true crime content.